Tesla's experiments. In 1889 Tesla began experimenting with capacitors charged to high voltages and discharged in very short time intervals. These very short pulses produced very sharp shock waves which he felt across the front of his whole body. He was aware that closing a switch on a high-voltage dynamo often produced a stinging shock. This was believed to be static electricity and it occurred only at switch on and only for a few milliseconds. However, in those few milliseconds, bluish needles of energy stand out from the electrical cables and they leak to ground, often through the bodies of any people standing nearby, causing immediate death if the installation is large. While the generators of that time were rated at some thousands of volts, these discharges were millions of volts in intensity. The generator problem was eliminated by the use of highly insulated switches which were provided with a very large ground connection. Tesla was intrigued by this phenomenon which appeared to match the effect of his capacitor discharges. He calculated that the voltages produced were hundreds of times greater than could be supplied by the capacitor or generator. It was clear that the power supplied was being amplified or augmented in some way, but the question was, from where was the extra energy coming? Tesla continued to investigate through experiments, taking precautions against the high voltages being produced. He was soon able to produce these shock waves whenever he wanted to. The shock waves produced a stinging sensation no matter where he stood in his laboratory, and hands and face were particularly sensitive to the wave. These waves radiated out and penetrated metal, glass and every other kind of material. This was clearly not an electromagnetic wave, so he called the new wave radiant electricity. Tesla searched the literature to find references to this radiant energy but he could not find much. In 1842, Dr. Joseph Henry had observed that steel needles were magnetized by a Leyden jar spark discharge located on a different floor of the building. The magnetizing wave had passed through brick walls, oak doors, heavy stone and iron flooring and tin ceilings to reach the needles located in a vault in the cellar. In 1872, Elihu Thomson took a large Ruhmkorff spark coil, attached one pole of the coil to a cold water pipe and the other pole to a metal tabletop. This resulted in a series of massive sparks which electrified the metal door knob of the room and produced the stinging shock waves which Tesla was investigating. He found that any insulated metal object anywhere in the building would produce long continuous white sparks discharging to ground. This discovery was written up briefly in the Scientific American Journal later that year. Tesla concluded that all of the phenomena which he had observed implied the presence of a medium of gaseous structure, that is, one consisting of independent carriers capable of free motion. Besides the air, another medium is present. This invisible medium is capable of carrying waves of energy through all substances, which suggests that, if physical, its basic structure is much smaller than the atoms which make up commonplace materials, allowing the stream of matter to pass freely through all solids. It appears that all of space is filled with this matter. Thomas Henry Moray demonstrated this energy flow passing through glass and lighting standard electric light bulbs. Harold Aspdin performed an experiment known as the Aspdin effect which also indicates the presence of this medium. Harold made this discovery when running tests not related to the subject. He started an electric motor which had a rotor mass of 800 grams and recorded the fact that it took an energy input of 300 joules to bring it up to its running speed of 3,250 revolutions per minute when it was driving no load. The rotor having a mass of 800 grams and spinning at that speed, its kinetic energy together with that of the drive motor is no more than 15 joules, contrasting with the excessive energy of 300 joules needed to get it rotating at that speed. If the motor is left running for 5 minutes or more, and then switched off, it comes to rest after a few seconds. But, the motor can then be started again, in the same or opposite direction, and brought up to speed with only 30 joules provided that the time lapse between stopping and restarting is no more than a minute or so. If there is a delay of several minutes, then an energy input of 300 joules is needed to get the rotor spinning again. This is not a transient heating phenomenon. At all times the bearing housings feel cool and any heating in the drive motor would imply an increase of resistance and a build-up of power to a higher steady-state condition. The experimental evidence is that there is something unseen, which is put into motion by the machine rotor. That something has an effective mass density 20 times that of the rotor, but it is something that can move independently and take several minutes to decay, while the motor comes to rest in a few seconds. Two machines of different rotor size and composition reveal the phenomenon, and tests indicate variations with time of day and compass orientation of the spin axis. One machine, the one incorporating weaker magnets, showed evidence of gaining strength magnetically during the tests, which were repeated over a period of several days. This clearly shows that there is an unseen medium which interacts with everyday objects and actions, and confirms Tesla's discovery. Tesla continued to experiment and determined that a very short unidirectional pulse is necessary to generate the radiant energy wave. In other words, an alternating voltage does not create the effect, it has to be a DC pulse. The shorter the pulse time and the higher the voltage, the greater the energy wave. He found that using a capacitor and an arc discharge mechanism with a very powerful permanent magnet placed at right angles to the spark, improved the performance of his equipment by a major factor. Additional experiments showed that the effects were altered by adjusting the duration of the electrical pulse. In each instance, the power of the radiated energy appeared to be constant irrespective of the distance from his apparatus. The energy was in the form of individual longitudinal waves. Objects placed near the equipment became powerfully electrified, retaining their charge for many minutes after the equipment was switched off. Tesla was using a charging dynamo as a power source, and he found that if he moved his magnetic discharger to one side of the dynamo, the radiant wave was positive. If he moved the magnetic discharger towards the other side of the dynamo, the radiant wave became negative in sign. This was clearly a new electrical force which traveled as light-like rays, showing them to be different in nature to the electromagnetic waves of Maxwell. Investigating the effects of adjusting the duration of the pulses, Tesla found that a pulse train which had individual pulses with durations exceeding 100 microseconds, produced pain and mechanical pressures. At this duration, objects in the field visibly vibrated and were even pushed along by the field. Thin wires subjected to sudden bursts of the radiant field, exploded into vapor. When the pulse duration was reduced to 100 microseconds or below, the painful effect was no longer felt and the waves are harmless. With a pulse duration of 1 microsecond, strong physiological heat was felt. With even shorter pulse durations, spontaneous illuminations capable of filling rooms with white light were produced. Even shorter pulses produced cool room-penetrating breezes with an accompanying uplift in mood and awareness. These effects have been verified by Eric Dollard, who has written about them in some detail. In 1890, Tesla discovered that if he placed a 2-foot-long single-turn deep copper helix coil near his magnetic disruptor, the thin-walled coil developed a sheath of white sparks with long silvery white streamers rising from the top of the coil. These discharges appeared to have much higher voltages than the generating circuit. This effect was greatly increased if the coil was placed inside the disruptor wire circle. The discharge seemed to hug the surface of the coil with a strange affinity, and rode up its surface to the open end. The shock wave flowed over the coil at right angles to the windings and produced very long discharges from the top of the coil. With the disruptor charge jumping 1 inch in its magnetic housing, the coil streamers were more than 2 feet in length. This effect was generated at the moment when the magnetic field quenched the spark, and it was wholly unknown at that time. This train of very short unidirectional pulses causes a very strange field to expand outwards. This field resembles a stuttering electrostatic field but has a far more powerful effect than would be expected from an electrostatic charge. Tesla was unable to account for the enormous voltage multiplication of his apparatus using any of the electrical formula of his day. He therefore presumed that the effect was entirely due to radiant transformation rules, which would have to be determined through experimental measurements. This he proceeded to do. Tesla had discovered a new induction law where radiant shock waves actually auto-intensified when encountering segmented objects. The segmentation was the key to releasing the action. Radiant shock waves encountered a helix and flashed over the outer skin, from end to end. This shock wave did not pass through the windings of the coil but treated the surface of the coil as a transmission path. Measurements showed that the voltage increase along the surface of the coil was exactly proportional to the length traveled along the coil, with the voltage increase reaching values of 10,000 volts per inch of coil. The 10,000 volts which he was feeding to his 24-inch coil were being magnified to 240,000 volts at the end of his coil. This was unheard of for simple equipment like that. Tesla also discovered that the voltage increase was mathematically linked to the resistance of the coil winding, with higher resistance windings producing higher voltages. Tesla then began to refer to his disruptor loop as his special primary and to the long helical coil as his special secondary, but he never intended anyone to equate these terms to those referring to electromagnetic transformers which operate in a completely different way. There was an attribute which baffled Tesla for a time. His measurements showed that there was no current flowing in the long copper secondary coil. Voltage was rising with every inch of the coil, but there was no current flow in the coil itself. Tesla started to refer to his measured results as his electrostatic induction laws. He found that each coil had its own optimum pulse duration and that the circuit driving it needed to be tuned to the coil by adjusting the length of the pulses to give the best performance. Tesla then noticed that the results given by his experiments paralleled the equations for dynamic gas movements, so he began wondering if the white flame discharges might not be a gaseous manifestation of electrostatic force. He found that when a metal point was connected to the upper terminal of the secondary coil, the streamers were directed very much like water flowing through a pipe. When the stream was directed at distant metal plates, it produced electronic charges which could be measured as current at the receiving site, but in transit, no current existed. The current only appeared when the stream was intercepted. Eric Dollard has stated that this intercepted current can reach several hundred or even thousands of amps. Tesla made another remarkable discovery. He connected a very heavy U-shaped copper bar directly across the primary of his disruptor, forming a dead short circuit. He then connected several ordinary incandescent filament bulbs between the legs of the U-shaped bar. When the equipment was powered up, the lamps lit with a brilliant cold white light. This is quite impossible with conventional electricity, and it shows clearly that what Tesla was dealing with was something new. This new energy is sometimes called cold electricity, and Edwin Gray Sr. demonstrated how different it is by lighting incandescent filament bulbs directly from his power tube, submerging them in water and putting his hand in the water. Cold electricity is generally considered to be harmless to humans. Ed Gray's power tube operates by generating radiant electricity waves by using a spark gap, and collecting the energy using 3 encasing copper cylinders surrounding the spark gap. The cylinders are drilled with many holes as that enhances the pickup, and the load is driven directly from the current in the cylinders. When lighting bulbs, Ed used an air cord transformer made of just a few turns of very heavy wire. I, personally, am aware of 2 people who have independently reproduced Ed's power tube. Tesla viewed the streamers coming off his coils as being wasted energy, so he tried to suppress them. He tried a conical coil but found that this accentuated the problem. He then tried placing a copper sphere at the top of his coil. This stopped the streamers, but electrons were dislodged from the copper sphere, creating really dangerous conditions. This implied that metals generate electron flows when struck by the coil streamers, as had been seen when the streamers had been aimed at remote metal plates and current was generated as a result. Tesla designed, built and used large globe lamps which required only a single external plate for receiving the radiant energy. No matter how far away these lamps were from the radiant source, they became brilliantly lit, almost to the level of an arc lamp, and far, far brighter than any of the conventional Edison filament lamps. By adjusting the voltage and the pulse duration of his apparatus, Tesla could also heat or cool a room. Tesla's experiments suggest that a method of extracting free energy is to use a Tesla coil which has a metal spike instead of the more common metal sphere at the end of the secondary coil. If the Tesla coil is fed with sufficiently short unidirectional pulses and the secondary coil pointed at a metal plate, then it should be possible to draw off serious levels of power from the metal plate, just as Tesla discovered. This has been confirmed by Don Smith, who uses two metal plates separated by a layer of plastic dielectric, forming a capacitor. He states that a well-designed Tesla coil is capable of producing currents as high as the voltages, and he demonstrates a handheld 28-watt Tesla coil plate on the first plate producing a substantial continuous spark discharge between the second plate and ground. I estimate that the spark produced would have to be thousands of volts at a significant current, which puts it in the kilowatt range, like most of Don's other devices. Video, http://www.metacafe.com watch 2820531 Don Smith Free Energy. Don's patent is in Chapter 3 and his .pdf document here, http://www.free-energy-info.tux.nl Smith.pdf, in which he explains many of his high-power designs. Strong permanent magnet spark snuffer. High voltage direct current supply. Primary coil. Secondary coil. Metal plate. Don also points out that the positioning of the primary coil relative to the secondary coil of a Tesla coil determines the amount of current which can be provided. Contrary to most opinion, it is possible to have Tesla coil current as high as the voltage. Don always stresses that you have the option of picking the electrical component, as conventional science has done, which leads to heat death, while the alternative option of selecting the magnetic component makes the world your oyster. With a magnetic ripple imposed on the zero-point energy field, which Don prefers to call the ambient background energy, you can make as many electric conversions as you wish, without depleting the magnetic event in any way. In other words, you can draw off serious amounts of current from capacitor plates positioned at right angles to the magnetic flow, and every additional pair of plates gives you an additional source of major current without any need to increase the magnetic disturbance in any way. With his single metal plate, Tesla mentioned currents of 1000 amps being available. Please remember that a Tesla coil produces seriously high voltages and is not a toy. Great care is needed around a Tesla coil, so, when it is running, keep well away from it. Don also states that the collection and transfer of energy requires temporary storage, which occurs as the capacitors and coils of a resonant circuit are cycled on and off. The frequency at which the capacitors and coils are pumped determines the amount of electrical energy that moves onwards. The amount of energy transferred relates directly to the density of lines of magnetic flux present. The kinetic energy formula is helpful in establishing the amount of energy present. This formula points to mass multiplied by the square of the velocity. In the case of electrical energy, intensity of voltage and amperes multiplied by cycles per second, replace velocity. Note that the acceleration of the voltage and the amperage increases in a nonlinear fashion as the law of squares applies, with each unit of increase causing a squaring of the flux lines present. In resonant air core coil energy transfer, the increase in flux lines present disturbs more electrons than previously, and this results in greater output energy than input energy being present and available. Energy stored, multiplied by the cycles per second, is the energy being pumped by the system. Capacitors and inductors, coils, temporarily store electrons. Capacitor formula: energy equals 1/2 capacitance times voltage squared times frequency. Where W is the energy in joules, joules equals volts times amps times seconds. C is the capacitance in farads. V is the voltage. Hertz is the cycles per second. Inductor formula: energy equals 1/2 inductance times amperage squared times frequency. Where W is the energy in joules. L is the inductance in henries. A is the current in amps. Hertz is the frequency in cycles per second. Both 1 Henry and 1 farad equal 1 volt. The higher the frequency, including the squaring of the flux lines, causes a large increase in the amount of energy being produced. This, combined with the use of a resonant energy induction system, all electrons moving in the same direction at the same time, make the move into coefficient of performance greater than 1 practical. The damping process of conventional electrical power generation, has all of the available electrons bouncing randomly, mostly cancelling out each other, and so the useful energy available is only a very small percentage of the energy which is present. In a resonant induction system, a very high percentage of the energy present is useful. When resonating, Ohm's impedance Z becomes zero and all of the energy present becomes available, without being degraded in any way. Ohms is load or wasted energy and amperes is the rate of that wasting. Now, apply this information to an air core coil resonant transformer energy system. L1 and L2 coils are now present. L1 has fewer turns and is several times the diameter of L2. Input from a 12-volt Gelsel high-voltage laser module produces 8000 volts with low, wasted energy, amperage into 4 turns of coil L1. Each turn of L1 then acquires 2000 volts of resonant potential. Each turn of L2 is then exposed to an electric flux of 2000 volts. Each turn at the bottom end of L2 acquires 2000 volts. The flux lines are squared and are additive as the voltage and amperage progress towards the top end of L2's many turns. A huge number of flux lines which were not previously present, occur at the top end of L2. These flux lines excite the electrons nearby in its earth and air and groundings. This high level of excitement above the ambient, causes a large number of electrons to become available, electrons which previously, were not part of the energy present. At this point, large amounts of excess energy is present. This coefficient of performance greater than 1 device produces energy at radio frequencies in the megahertz range, and this allows it to be small in size and yet produce large amounts of energy. A megawatt-sized unit will sit comfortably on a breakfast table. The energy is changed to direct current, and then, to the desired working frequency. The energy powering these devices is drawn from the surrounding energy field and is not conventional electricity, and it does not flow through the wire of the secondary coil, but instead, it runs along the outside of the coil and through space to strike the surface of the metal plate, where it generates conventional electric current. Thomas Henry Moray demonstrated that this energy flowing along the outside of the wire can pass through glass without being affected in any way. In his 1995 paper, Don Smith presents the following diagram. Volts dominate if the L1 coil is far right. Volts and amps are about equal if the L1 is central. Volts represent the more negative and amperage is the less negative. Therefore, the electrical charge of more negative must seek the less negative to regain ambient. While Tesla's experiment used a metal plate, he patented US 512,340, a coil type which he said is very effective in picking up this radiant energy. This pancake coil type goes by the rather impressive name of bifilar serial connected coil, which, despite its impressive name, is not difficult to wind using 2 separate strands of wire as shown here. If a strong magnetic field is positioned across the spark gap as shown above, it sharpens the cut-off of the spark and enhances the unidirectional character of the pulse of current. It should be remembered that if a very short, sharp pulse of unidirectional current such as is produced by a spark jumping across a spark gap as in the arrangement shown above, occurs in a conductor, then a strong wave of radiant energy radiates out in a plane at right angles to the pulse of current. This radiant energy wave is quite different from the electromagnetic field generated around the wire carrying the pulse of current. In the Tesla coil arrangement shown above, it should be possible to gather additional free energy through one or more coaxial, like layers of an onion, cylindrical coils around the spark gap leads. These coils will work better if they are wound as bifilar, serially connected coils. The reason for this is that the self-induction of the coils can be zero at any particular frequency because a Tesla pancake, or cylindrical, coil can act as a resonant coil at one particular frequency. This effect is because the capacitance between adjacent turns of the coil is dramatically altered by the raised voltage difference produced by the winding method, and as a result, the combined capacitance of all the turns along with the coil's self-inductance, gives a result where the coil appears to have just magnetic and resistance characteristics and no self-inductance at all, as pointed out in Tesla's US 512,340 patent. Tesla was granted US Patent 685,957 apparatus for the utilization of radiant energy, in which he shows various ways of handling the energy collected by the metal plate. It is likely that the pickup techniques shown in the patent of Hermann Plosten, which is in the appendix, would also work very effectively with this collected energy. Old patents sometimes mention a condenser, which is the original term for what is nowadays called a capacitor. After careful consideration and many experiments, Tesla concluded that the radiant rays which he was utilizing, radiated out so rapidly that electrons were unable to keep up with them. The rays were being carried via a medium consisting of extremely mobile, almost massless particles, very much smaller than electrons, and which, because of their size and speed, could pass easily through most materials. In spite of their small size, their extreme speed caused them to have considerable momentum. A fact which is very difficult to come to terms with is that these rays seem to propagate outwards instantly, with no time delay at all, as if transmitted through matter which is wholly incompressible. It is sometimes called radiant energy or RE for short, and appears to have no net charge in conventional terms. This is a unique feature of the universe, with unique characteristics, which if utilized, provides a whole host of new applications and capabilities. Tesla considered that this newly discovered field acted like a fluid. 115 years later, the cover story of the December 2005 edition of the Scientific American Journal states that experimental models hint that space-time could be a kind of fluid. It has taken a long time for modern science to start catching up with Tesla. In actual fact, it was Michael Faraday, 1781 to 1867, who came up with the idea in the first place.